Hey all, Pedantic Skeptic here, and today we are going to be responding to a YouTube channel called Tomorrow's World. Tomorrow's World is a Christian YouTube channel. Their description says, Tomorrow's World helps hundreds of thousands of people make sense of the world through the pages of the Bible. Using the truth, prophecies, and hope of God's word, Tomorrow's World is helping people understand the world we live in. Today we are going to be watching their video called Why Evolution is Not True, 4 Major Flaws Exposed. And so let's just jump right in. Okay.
Called one of the most powerful and influential scientific theories in history, the theory of evolution by natural selection.
Just a heads up, natural selection is not the only mechanism for which evolution occurs. There's also gene flow and mutation, as well as artificial selection.
First published well more than a century ago by Charles Darwin, and its powerful influence on life in virtually every realm of understanding would indeed be hard to overestimate. But is it true?
Yes, evolution occurs. It is a well-established scientific fact.
Many would respond, of course, evolution has been proven true 1,000 times over. All the evidence we have says evolution is a fact of nature.
And they'd be correct in saying that.
But is the evidence really that solid? Is the theory of evolution really indisputable? No, it is not. And today we'll pull back the curtain on some of the evidence that many evolutionists would prefer you not see. Join us for this episode of Tomorrow's World, where we will expose some of evolution's dirty little secrets. Welcome to Tomorrow's World, where we help you understand your world through the pages of the Bible. And our topic today might seem far removed from those pages, the theory of evolution. It is perhaps one of the single most influential scientific theories in history.
I would say that the germ theory of disease is more influential than evolution. Honestly, if we objectively look at how we've made people's lives better through science and technology, the germ theory of disease is a little bit higher up there.
With immeasurable impact on science, philosophy, education, politics, and religion.
I mean, evolution should really only be a scientific matter.
And we are assured by many that it is undoubtedly true, that no one of any intelligence or education would even dare to question it.
So, I would step back for just a minute, because when you say any intelligence or education, you're presupposing that this is something that people are introduced to at a very early age. Evolution is generally taught starting, in the middle school, era of your education. It's certainly not something that preschoolers are learning. They just don't have the brain power to conceptualize it.
Well, today we will dare to question it.
And there's nothing wrong with questioning things. If you have legitimate, good faith questions where you want to know more about it, or you see, a serious problem with it that isn't just a matter of it contradicting your religious beliefs, go ahead and question it. The science will speak for itself.
Because while evolution puts up a good front, it has a long list of dirty little secrets that you don't tend to hear about in your classrooms or television programming. And the more you learn about what evolution has to hide, the more you wonder why so many put faith in an idea that remains unproven.
First of all, you don't prove things in science, you give evidence for them. But also, the who wants to bet that he's not even going to give a succinct definition of evolution? I doubt he's even going to tell us what evolution actually is. Now, evolution is basically just changes in allele frequency within populations over successive generations. But let's see if that's where he goes with this.
It's a big topic and we'll only scratch the surface today. Now, before we begin, let's understand what we mean by evolution. Claiming that life began in a vastly simpler form, similar perhaps to a microscopic bacterium, the theory of evolution
As opposed to a macroscopic bacterium?
says that over billions of years, life changed slowly, that the struggle for survival rewarded slight random variations in the descendants of that life form that gave them an edge.
Sort of. It is more about how much of the population your genotype represents, which is reflected by how successful you are at reproducing. And over time, you become a greater proportion of that population. So if you are in, say, an area that gets cold in the winter, the organisms that have some way of dealing with the cold tend to have more babies over time than the organisms that don't have a way of coping with the cold. And that can be behavioral, such as migration, or it could be some physiological means, like hibernation, dormancy, diapause, or what have you. And we're not going to get into all those, but, depending on what organism we're talking about, it can go dormant, it can diapause, it can go into hibernation, brumation, whatever.
Perhaps allowing them to find food faster or reproduce more successfully.
More efficiently, but yes.
And similarly, it punished those descendants whose random adaptations were less
Adaptations.
favorable for survival. In this way, and through this unintelligent, unguided process, evolution says those microscopic bacteria-like organisms a few billion years ago have been able to turn into the astonishing variety of life forms we see today.
So, fun fact, there is a lot of horizontal gene flow that occurs between microbes that we think is partially responsible for some of the diversity we see in eukaryotic lines. Basically, bacteria can actually insert tubes into one another and trade or give each other pieces of their genome, and that gives bacteria new abilities. And so you can see this where you have two bacteria species that are fairly closely related, but they're two separate species nonetheless, and you put them on an antibiotic rich plate, and if one species is antibiotic resistant and the other one is not, what you will end up seeing over time is a gradual increase in the number of the antibiotic susceptible ones, because they, before they die, are given the antibiotic resistance genes from their counterparts,
including us. No divine designer or creator necessary.
That's not a terrible description of evolution. He hit most of the major points. I do want to just quickly touch upon that it's not random, but now some of the mutations that occur are random, but he didn't touch on mutations or even sources of different variation, which is slightly problematic, but that is a matter for a different day.
Not long ago, Sotheby's, the famous auction house, offered a first edition of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, published in 1859.
So, actually, let me let him finish what he's saying.
The book in which he first published the theory of evolution. Now, at least when I saw it, Sotheby's recommended estimate for the book was $250,000 to $300,000.
Yeah, people can get sentimental about things. I don't understand it. It's not that I don't it's not that I have an issue with evolution. I don't know why the fuck somebody would want to spend $300,000 on an old book written in the 1800s by an old scientist guy. I don't feel that sentimental about things. But the only reason it was being sold was because the person who was selling it happened to, be taking advantage of people's sentimental nature. I can't fault the person for that, but shame on us for being so sentimental about something that you're able to make that much money on something fairly arbitrary.
You might think, why so high? It's just a book. Well, there are numerous factors, but the book's role in human history is perhaps the greatest. Sotheby's calls the book one of the greatest achievements of scientific discovery. Referring to Darwin's book, science historian Bern Dibner once wrote, "This, the most important single work in science, brought man to his true place in nature."
I mean, that depends. It depends on what you think of nature. I think of nature as just the universe and, all that's in it. And I feel like something like cosmology and astronomy and stuff like that puts us in our place a little bit better because it's outside of the confines of living portions of nature. It's also, shows us how small we are and things like that. And, this is one person's opinion on, this book. But what I will say is that the originator of any scientific hypothesis is not going to have all the answers on, the theory that it becomes. And so we have learned a lot more about life on Earth, evolution, and the various processes that guide evolution since Darwin's time. Give me a sec.
High-sounding praise to be sure. But is it accurate? That depends, of course, on whether the theory is true.
So in Darwin's day, it was still a hypothesis. I don't see these people going after, some of the early physicists and astronomers and, other scientists who came up with various ideas about other aspects of science, even though, some of the earlier models for any science are way off.
If all life as we know it today is the result of nothing but mindless processes, then yes, Darwin's book is a towering achievement in human history, a monumental discovery that does truly put man in his place as nothing special, nothing remarkable.
So, what is it about coming from something divine or supernatural that makes us more special than if we just came about naturally? I don't understand that. I don't base my opinions on things on what the source of those things was. That's called poisoning the well. But I feel like things should be viewed as spectacular, magnificent on their own merit, not necessarily what gave rise to them.
Just a random life form on a random planet. And life, it turns out, has no real meaning at all.
What's wrong with that? This is an appeal to emotion.
Again, if that theory is true. Now, of course, many claim it is true and claim so very loudly. Evolutionary apologist Jerry Coyne writes in his popular book, Why Evolution is True, evolution is a fact, and far from casting doubt on Darwinism, the evidence gathered by scientists over the past century and a half supports it completely, showing that evolution happened and that it happened largely as Darwin proposed, through the workings of natural selection. Of course, many want it to be true. Evolution has become an escape hatch for those who want to explain away the beautiful diversity and complexity of life.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Without a creator. As famous biologist Richard Dawkins once said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Is he right? Again, only if evolution has been proven true. And in fact, it is not. Despite claims that all the evidence supports it completely, the truth is that evolution has a whole host of dirty little secrets that our classrooms and popular science programs don't talk about too loud.
I mean, you're 6 minutes in and you haven't gotten to those yet. Come on, let's get the show on the road, man.
Loudly. The first dirty little secret of evolution is this. Even the simplest living cell is devastating to the theory of evolution.
Is this going to be an irreducible complexity argument?
In Darwin's day, little was known about cells. Single-celled organisms like amoebas were described by Charles Darwin's contemporary George Henry Lewis as simply a microscopic lump of jelly-like substance or protoplasm, entirely destitute of texture and consequently destitute of organs.
Yes, they didn't have such high-powered microscopes back then they could identify portions of cells.
In other cells, such as those in our body, a nucleus could be seen, but its purpose was a mystery and the cell seemed otherwise generally featureless. In such days when the smallest, simplest unit of life seemed that simple, just a bit of jelly with a few boring features, it was easy to imagine somehow within that mysterious, life-giving jelly, anything could happen. But as microscopes improved and techniques were developed to tease out the secrets of the inner world of the cell, we have discovered that this supposedly simple jelly-like substance is filled with machinery of astonishing complexity, ingenuity, and design. The world of the human cell, for instance, is one in which approximately 1 billion chemical reactions take place every single second.
I'm not going to fact check that. It's not really relevant to the argument here, but the thing you got to remember is that evolution deals with everything that happened after the beginning of life. So, what got the first cell to be the first cell with all of its bits and pieces is not the concern of evolutionary theory.
And these are not random chemical reactions. A human cell is filled with thousands upon thousands of proteins of 10,000 different varieties, molecular machines designed to work together to achieve specific purposes, manipulating their surroundings, creating new structures, and dismantling old ones, in a dynamic dance of complexity that would make the space shuttle seem simple. Life is impossible without these complex machines, and even small changes to organisms, as hypothesized by evolution, requires changes to these machines, even the design of new machines. And that is as unlikely as it sounds.
So what if it's unlikely? It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it actually happened.
Biochemist Douglas Axe has examined the probability of even one protein of any significant functionality at all forming by chance, and estimated it to be 1 in 10 to the 64.
Question. Didn't you just say that hundreds of billions of chemical reactions are occurring in every cell, every second? When you scale that to the lifetime of an organism, it's perfectly reasonable that multiple functional proteins are going to change.
That is 1 out of a number that is a 1 followed by 64 zeros.
63 zeros, actually.
Along with colleague Ann Gager, Axe explored the possibility that one protein could evolve from another similar one based on just a handful of necessary changes to DNA, and found that, at currently understood rates of mutation, it would take 10 to the 27 years for such a change to take place.
So, remember that these changes aren't occurring consecutively, necessarily. These different changes to genetic code can be occurring simultaneously. Every time DNA replicates itself, which depending on the cell is going to be between, every 20 minutes to never, just depends on the organism, the cell, and 10 other things. You're going to have a lot of DNA replicating itself, and you're going to have errors in that replication. Generally, those errors are fixed, but there is enough DNA, there is enough replication, there are enough errors where errors slip through the cracks. We did that whole codon wheel thing in a different video of mine, where you have basically a set of 3 amino acids in the sequence that basically call for a certain amino acid, and the amino acid that it calls for builds that protein until it's finalized. Okay, now the thing about that is many amino acids, there are 64 possible triplet codes, so 64 possible combinations of the 3 nucleic acids that can happen, but only 20 possible amino acids. So you're going to have a lot of overlap, which means you could have a mutation that doesn't actually do anything like change the structure of that protein. Now, the other thing you have to realize is that mutation rates aren't constant. Okay? There are times in Earth's history when there is more UV light hitting, there is, a higher temperature or more chemicals in the air. A number of things influence mutation rate. We have average mutation rates, but remember that an average doesn't mean constant. Okay? Average only tells you when you add up all the different numbers and divide them by the number of numbers you have, you get a number that's your average. That's all it tells you. Now, aside from that, mutation is not the only source of genetic variation in organisms that you have to consider. You also have to consider mating. You also have to consider the uptake of foreign genetic bodies. This doesn't happen as often in animals as it happens in things like bacteria and plants, but it does happen. And you also have to consider that many times organisms are infected with viruses that insert pieces of their DNA into your own DNA, or they give you pieces of RNA, because remember, viruses usually have only RNA or only DNA, never both, but whatever. There are viruses that actually insert portions of their genome into their hosts perpetually. So mutation is not the only source of genetic variation within organisms.
Again, that's a 1 followed by 27 zeros. Impressive given that scientists think our universe is only 13 billion years old, or about a 1 followed by 10 zeros.
And I don't think the Earth is that old either, but that's a different matter.
In other words, it's just not going to happen apart from intelligent intervention. Again, even the simplest living cell is devastating to the theory of evolution. We mentioned DNA a moment ago, and the nature of DNA is another of evolution's dirty little secrets, because DNA represents an abstract coding system that points to intelligence.
No. DNA is a string of chemicals that undergoes chemical reactions according to the laws of chemistry. We happen to assign values to the different chemicals within DNA, but it doesn't mean that the DNA is actually a code in the sense that, a 1 and a 0 and a 1 and a 0 will be a code on a computer program.
Deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short, was unknown in Darwin's day, and is the molecule responsible for carrying the information needed to build all of the proteins that make life possible.
Do I want to correct this? Okay. In general, yes. In most systems, DNA is the main molecule responsible for heredity and things like that. Now, there are other factors that can influence the outcome of an organism, such as something called cytoplasmic inheritance, which is basically just a carryover of RNA from the egg cell that it comes from, and has nothing to do with the DNA code. That is, I know I'm being a little nitpicky here, but the reason why is because if these people want to try and dismantle a theory, they really should have all of this kind of down pat.
Each nucleus in each individual normal cell in your body contains about 2 meters of DNA.
That is also not entirely true. In some female animals, the cells that aren't going to become eggs will actually delete one of the X chromosomes, or or it'll at least silence it, where an X chromosome isn't passed along to the next generation of cells. That's why you get calico cats, actually. You get a calico cat because you have the color genes on the X chromosomes, and females are XX. Generally, calicos have to have a third X, I believe, from what I remember from genetics class. But the early in development, the X chromosomes are randomly destroyed. The extra X chromosomes are randomly destroyed, so you have some cell lines in the animal's body that have the X chromosome with a white color gene, some with an orange, some with a black, whatever. And that's why you get a calico cat that just seems to have this like clusterfuck of cool color pattern. I love calico cats, they're adorable, but that's the underlying mechanism.
Packed into a microscopic dot, all of it containing the information needed to build you. DNA uses base pairs combining 4 different compounds that act like the ones and zeros in computer code.
No, because it's binary, not, never mind.
Detailing to the cellular machinery the information needed to build all of the complex proteins life requires. Information from the DNA is carried from place to place,
Psilocybin.
where proteins read the code and assemble new proteins from precisely sequenced amino acids based on that information, making every one of your cells a complex chemical factory, creating purposefully arranged nanoscopic machinery and some of the most complicated chemical compounds found anywhere in the universe.
That doesn't mean that it's designed or built by a creator.
But where did this abstract programming code originate? Evolution can't take credit. It's a mindless, purposeless process, remember? In fact, where did DNA come from?
So, there have been experiments where nucleic acids and similar chemicals could spontaneously arrange themselves under certain conditions that were hypothesized to be early Earth conditions. But it doesn't really matter because evolution doesn't deal with what happened before the first cell existed. I don't know why this is such a hard thing for people to wrap their heads around.
You can't build proteins without DNA, and yet DNA is itself assembled by proteins.
Sort of. At its base, yes.
The discovery of DNA should have been a great success for evolution. The secret to how the characteristics of life are passed on to our descendants was finally unveiled. But it has been a disaster. The idea of a massive, information-rich molecule containing an abstract programming code capable of bearing the information needed to build all the complex machinery of life is incompatible with the idea that life has supposedly grown in complexity through mindless natural processes. Evolutionists cannot avoid the fact that DNA represents an abstract coding system that points to intelligence.
So, fun fact, there is actually a hypothesis that the earliest life forms didn't use DNA, but rather RNA. And that's a story for another day, but RNA can spontaneously form itself, even out of inorganic compounds.
Our next dirty secret of evolution is an opportunity to turn the tables a bit. In short, the gaps in the fossil record since Darwin's day have gotten worse, not better. The theory of evolution depends on the slow and steady accumulation of small variation.
Define slow because you can have bacteria develop antibiotic resistance in a couple hours.
Since large jumps in changes would imply an active designer or planner. The result should be a smooth transition in the fossil record, with animals gradually, almost imperceptibly, turning into new animals.
So one of the problems with the fossil record that you gotta understand is that it only preserves, for the most part, hard tissues. There are exceptions, but in general, you can't necessarily get a full grasp of what the organism looked like. So, whereas you might have these, very similar skeletal structures up until a certain point, and then the skeleton of the predecessor looks way different, you don't know what the soft tissue arrangement of that animal was. Now, these people really like to harp on the animal kingdom, and I don't see people disputing evolution by using plants, which is weird. But we do see in plants living examples of basically every ancient lineage and every step plants took on the way to becoming what they are now. So we have the choanoflagellates, which are like the single-celled versions of plants. So operationally, you have to be multicellular to be a plant. That's why, well, that's one of the reasons why algae aren't plants. I'm not saying there's no such thing as multicellular algae, but there are. Kelp, for example, is a multicellular algae. But algae is not a plant. But we have early forms of plants that we know of. We have our non-vascular plants still alive. We have our pteridophytes, ferns. We have the earliest seed plants still alive. We have, gymnosperms, which are non-flowering, that have flower-like structures that are just on their way to becoming angiosperm-like. We have a lot of our angiosperms, we have our basal angiosperms that are neither monocot nor dicot, and things like that. We have all of these different steps on the way to becoming the most advanced plants, which are going to be your monocots.
Through small, smooth changes. But this is not what the fossil record shows. Instead of a smooth, continuous transition of creatures, the record indicates gaps between different kinds of creatures. As Michael Denton wrote in his seminal work, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, the overall picture of life on Earth today is so discontinuous, the gaps between the different types so obvious, that as Stephen Stanley reminds us in his recent book, Macroevolution, if our knowledge of biology was restricted to those species presently existing on Earth, we might wonder whether the doctrine of evolution would qualify as anything more than an outrageous hypothesis.
See, that's just not accurate, because we have a lot of information from DNA and embryology and other sources that illustrate very clear relationships between organisms.
Without intermediates or transitional forms to bridge the enormous gaps which separate existing species and groups of organisms, the concept of evolution could never be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis. Of course, seemingly continuous lines of some animals are trotted out for display to pretend the gaps are not nearly as damaging as they are. For instance, you will see theoretical sequences for whale, horse, and human evolution. Yet not only are these sequences themselves deceptive and not proven lines of descent at all, the fact remains that if evolution is true, these sorts of sequences should be the norm, not the rare exception. Ironically, evolutionists often accuse believers of having faith in a God of the gaps, who magically does all the things they cannot explain. Such a misunderstanding aside, the unexplainable gaps in the fossil record a thorn in Darwin's side that remains just as thorny more than 150 years later, turned the tables and put evolutionists in the place of wielding blind faith and believing in a Darwin of the gaps.
So here's the thing. We don't need the fossil record to show us evolution. No, evolution doesn't happen in this linear sequence of there's this one organism, and then after a couple generations it's a different organism, and then after another couple generations it's a different. It is more like roots kind of extending outward, and so one population starts to send off new forms as time goes on for whatever reason, and you end up seeing some of the results of that in the fossil record. But we can't expect the fossil record to be complete given what we know about fossil formation and things like that, and obviously given the way that rocks cycle through the crust of the earth and everything, there's going to be a point in time where fossils from a certain time frame in the past are no longer existent.
For our next dirty secret, all you need to do is look in the mirror at your remarkable evolution-defying eyes. Because evolution continues to offer no good explanation for how new organs can form.
I don't know what he means by that. So, when he says new organ, does he literally mean you give birth to a baby that now has just this sudden new gland or something like that within it? Because that's not really what evolution is, about. Evolution is just about changes in allele frequency in populations over successive generations. Now, speciation and things like that are extensions of evolutionary theory, but evolution doesn't necessarily, at its core, rely on new species coming about.
In the Psalms, King David praises God and proclaims to his Creator, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." And we see part of that wonder in the organs of the body, such as the eye.
And the appendix that can become infected and fucking kill you if it's not cut out by a skilled surgeon.
After all, organs represent not just specialized tissues, but interwoven systems, often systems upon systems, finely tuned and exquisitely structured to work together. And if one part is missing, the whole can fail.
Not always true. For example, you can live with a third of your liver. You have a lot of extra liver tissue that you don't need. You have extra organs. I almost was a living kidney donor. The reason I didn't become a living kidney donor was because at the time I was at a transitional point in my life, and the recovery time from having one of my kidneys removed was going to be something that I wouldn't be able to deal with. And maybe down the line when I'm older and I have more of my shit figured out, I will become a living donor. I plan on doing that. I'm a regular blood donor. I grow out my hair and cut it off to donate that to kids with cancer and stuff like that. But in any case, there are organs that you don't need. Okay? It doesn't mean that they have no use. It just means your body can make do without them being there.
And improving the entire organ would often involve each piece or part evolving in conjunction with all the other pieces in a coordinated way. A coordination that evolution does not allow. The problem was summarized not long ago in an article in The Guardian. First, the paper gives the traditional explanation for the supposed evolution of the eye, given by thousands of teachers over the decades to tens of thousands of students. Animals that have light-sensitive cells for some reason experience a series of slight mutations that increasingly give them survival advantages, such as the slight cupping of the flesh around the cells that helps to focus the light, a clear covering of some sort eventually to seal the space, which slowly becomes a lens. Then muscles arrive to shape and focus the lens better, etc. The Guardian continues, This is the basic story of evolution, as recounted in countless textbooks and pop science bestsellers. The problem, according to a growing number of scientists, is that it is absurdly crude and misleading.
So I have a question. Let's assume this guy knows the basics of how the eye works. So what basically happens is you have these chemicals inside of your eye. When light hits a chemical in your eye, it sends a certain nerve impulse into your brain. Okay, it's an electrical signal. The length of that electrical signal, the duration of it hitting that part of your brain, tells the brain what color that light was. And when that is happening across millions of cells from every little stream of light coming, bouncing off of different objects, you get this, picture. So your brain is telling you in real time what light is coming off of different things. And that allows you to perceive sight. Now, that's not an overly complicated process. It's basically just one form of energy hitting a form of matter to convert into a different form of energy that hits a different form of matter, and then an electrical impulse is perceived by the brain. Why is it that these people have no problem accepting that those chemical reactions occur, but they have a hard time accepting that those chemical reactions were the underlying basis for some of these processes can only happen in a complicated structure? There are light sensing patches of pigment on plants. They're not eyes, but they have some of the same underlying mechanisms that eyes have. One of the things that you'll know is that, that you'll learn if you study plants, is that in plants that have a dormant period mediated by seasonality, for example, the amount of far red light, which is light that is brought about by sunrise and sunset, mediates the plant's response. So basically what happens is, when there is a smaller gap between far red light exposure, instead of every 12 hours there's far red light, maybe, there's far red light during, far red light comes 8 hours and then 16 hours, and depending on how far away that red light, not far red, but red, is, it's going to tell the plant, basically, whether it's summertime, fall, winter, what have you. And that mediates what kinds of proteins and hormones and things like that are produced by the plant, which then mediates things like dormancy and flowering and things like that. It's very complex in one way, but it's also very simple, because it's really just a certain type of light is activating a chemical reaction inside of the cell, and then the cell repairs itself from that, and the more repair it gets to do before the light hits it again and does that damage, if you will. It's not really damage, it's more of a shuffling of the electrons. I don't fully understand that. It's not my main realm of study, but I have a general conception of how it works, and I'm just going to relay it to you in a little bit of a simplified way. It's like, just imagine like far red light is a gentle tap, and red light is a smack. And the tap is kind of just to relax you, and the smack is to get you up and running. And the length of time that passes between each tap and each slap is going to tell the cell and then the whole plant what it should be doing next.
For one thing, it starts midway through the story, taking for granted the existence of light-sensitive cells, lenses, and irises without explaining where they came from in the first place. nor does it adequately explain how such delicate and easily disrupted components mesh together to form a single organ. And it isn't just eyes that the traditional theory struggles with. The first eye, the first wing, the first placenta, how they emerge.
So remember that in evolution, things get repurposed. And so wings didn't just arise. There were first groups of tissues and then organs that enabled certain abilities, such as catching wind or, manipulating the air around the animal's body, that could then eventually be repurposed into wings.
Explaining these is the foundational motivation of evolutionary biology, says Armin Mochek, a biologist at Indiana University. In short, evolution promises us it can explain the organs of our bodies and how they supposedly formed gradually over millennia, but in reality, it hasn't a clue. Our fourth dirty little secret, the fact that evolution continues to offer no good explanation for how new organs can form, is devastating to a theory that was developed more than 150 years ago to explain that very fact.
No, evolution simply explains how allele frequencies in populations can change over the generations. Okay? That's why it's not just natural selection that causes evolution. For example, let's suppose we have a forest of willow trees, alright? And you have 50 willow trees that have a recessive allele for having white hairs on the bottom of the leaves. And then you have 50 willow trees that are dominant for the green hairs on the bottom of the leaves, because willows can have different color hairs on the bottom of the leaves. Let's say somebody decides to cut down several of the white hair leaf willows. Now the frequency of the white hair allele in that population of willow trees has decreased. That is technically evolution. That would be probably artificial selection or gene flow, things like that. And gene flow or genetic drift can encompass a couple different processes like bottlenecks and founder effects. But evolution is really just how allele frequencies change over time. Now, that doesn't mean that speciation doesn't occur. It just means that it's not necessary for evolution to be the case. Now, as far as organs, in organisms, especially animals, it's a little different in plants. But remember that not all organisms have organs. So technically, certain fungi, plants, and animals are the only organisms that definitionally have to have organs. Animals are multicellular eukaryotes with cell type specialization and, which generally means organs, and an internal digestive column, which also generally means organs. Plants are multicellular eukaryotes that have cell walls as well as a sterile cell lining of the embryo and cell type specialization in organs, which again, the cell type specialization, multicellularity, and lining around the embryo is why or lining around the gametes is why algae are not plants. Algae don't have that sterile lining around their gametes that plants do, but that's just a little point. All plants are necessarily multicellular, for example. All plants have cell type specialization in organs, even if they're primitive organs. So non-vascular plants, for example, don't have true leaves, but that's another, just minor point. Now, organs in animals are usually defined by mapping genes, such as, forget exactly what they're called, like toolbox genes and some other things, blanking on the name. But different genes basically determine where organs go. And if there's a mistake in one of those genes, if there's a mutation, you can have something extra come about. And if that's perpetuated over time, it can change into something else. So you have, for example, organs in mammals that aren't in reptiles, such as mammary glands.
You know, let me confess something. I know it's considered a cinema classic, but I've personally never been a big fan of The Wizard of Oz. Frankly,
Me neither.
when I first saw it, I was a little kid, and the flying monkeys were pretty spooky. But as I've grown older, one scene has remained with me and has become a real favorite. It's close to the end of the movie as Dorothy and her band are confronting the terrifying wizard.
Wait, you're ruining the end for me. I'm just kidding.
For the fact that he is failing to keep his promises. As they do so, flames shoot out, thunder crashes, and the wizard speaks to them as a giant green monstrous head hovering in the air in front of them, shouting, "Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz." Meanwhile, Dorothy's dog Toto makes his way to a green curtain
I thought Toto was a girl.
off to the left and pulls it aside to reveal a small, white-haired old man using a machine to create the illusion they're all looking at and speaking into a microphone to amplify his voice and make it sound terrifying. My favorite part in that scene is when the old man turns around, notices they can see him, and turns back to the microphone to demand, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." Well, the forces arrayed to convince people not to question the theory of evolution are very similar. There's a lot of thunder and flame, impressive proclamations about
Where? I don't see anybody, getting up and screaming about evolution or, being unreasonable at all.
proof and evidence, and a lot of theater designed to make you think that there's nothing to doubt. But like the wizard, evolution has not kept its promises. The theory promises an explanation of your origins, an explanation that needs no God, no intelligence at all, just an initial microbe, careless natural processes, and a few billion years. We need to be willing to pull back the curtain, to not be so impressed by the theater that we don't question what we're shown, and to not be so intimidated that we aren't willing to stand up and call evolution out for not keeping its promises. Or to borrow from another fiction, it might have been a hard day when you first learned Santa Claus wasn't real, but that realization brought you that much deeper into the real world and much further from a world of make-believe. Recognizing the dirty little secrets of evolution can help you step away from the world of make-believe.
So, to sum up, we've got irreducible complexity. We've got irreducible complexity. We've got a misrepresentation of what the fossil record is supposed to show. And we've got, irreducible complexity?
As well. Yet the questions evolutionists seek to answer remain. Where do we come from? How did life come to be? Is there any purpose to it all? And if so, what might that purpose be? Unclouded by the evolutionary theater, you can seek the real answers to those questions. And if you really seek with an open mind and an open heart, with God's help, you will find your way to the only possible starting place in the search for those answers. The very first sentence of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I hope you'll find the courage to look behind the curtain more often.
Oh,
Thanks for watching. If you're interested in the free offer that we have today, please check the description where you'll find a link. And we hope that you enjoyed everything here at Tomorrow's World. All of us here are devoted to helping you.
all right. Well, that was not fun. There was not really much of substance there. So, yeah. I hope you all enjoyed, and what we'll do is, I probably won't, upload this tonight. I'm really exhausted. I went on a 6.5 mile hike, in the mountains earlier today, and, I don't know if I have the energy to go ahead and edit and then mash together all 3 components of this, but hopefully tomorrow or the next day it'll be out. You know, the thing to remember is that evolutionary theory really is just about genetic change in populations, change in allele frequencies and things like that. What it leads to is a different matter, but at its core, there really shouldn't be any dispute that evolution occurs. So, stay pedantic, stay romantic, and far from the Atlantic. And I hope everybody has a good one.